Hi, everyone. This presentation is part of my research update series. And in this presentation, I'll be discussing recent developments regarding the hallmarks of cancer. So it's the hallmarks of cancer, part 2. If you haven't viewed part 1, you please do go back and have a look, because to me, this is a hugely exciting area of research, and indeed a theoretical underpinning for some of the concepts that we can employ that might help the patient suffering from cancer, and indeed quite relevantly might help with preventing cancer. So just to recap, in part 1, I discussed 2 important papers on the hallmarks of cancer. The first one by Hanahan and Weinberg in 2000 that defined these 6 hallmarks of cancer. They're all discussed in part 1. And then later on, about 10, 11 years later, they published with some emerging hallmarks of cancer that, as you'll see, are now considered to be accepted. So there were 2 emerging hallmarks, and they introduced this concept of enabling characteristics. So not strictly hallmarks, but might as well be. I guess it's a case of semantic. So 2 new hallmarks, 2 enabling characteristics, and they also stressed the importance of an 11th factor, the tumor microenvironment. So 11 factors. That's where it was in 2011. So then Hanahan subsequently published in The Lancet this paper, Rethinking the War on Cancer. And he put forward the hypothesis is that even these modern targeted therapies are generally not curative or indeed enduringly effective, because they only basically have a limited one-dimensional approach. They're just targeting one hallmark, typically in one particular sphere of activity of the cancer, as you'll see, and that really we need to have a rethink. So this was a fascinating discussion paper he published in 2014. And he used a military metaphor, which is often used in the context of cancer. So he suggested that we have a 3-dimensional battle space plan that attacks cancer in a full-scale war, rather than individually targeted skirmishes that, for example, are just targeting one hallmark here and there. So he suggested we target all key hallmarks at the same time. So that's not necessarily all 10, but maybe a selection of them that are most relevant to the tumor under study. And that way, if you target all the key hallmarks at the same time, you're stopping the adaptive nature of the cancer, where it will overcome that blockage or that impediment and adapt around it. But if you're targeting more than just one hallmark, the ability of the cancer cell to adapt in that way will be correspondingly more limited. He also suggested that we need to target the tumor microenvironment, that 11th factor, and all the accessory cell types that support and nourish and help that tumor survive and defend itself that we find in the tumor microenvironment. And he suggested that we address the battle space across multiple battlefields of cancer, not just the primary tumor, but also the tumor microenvironment, disseminating lymph nodes and blood vessels, draining lymph nodes, and even distant organs in terms of metastasis risk. So a very radical concept. And there you have the 10 hallmarks, and he's giving examples. So, for example, that's it. Example A is the example of targeting all 10 at once if you can, but he said maybe just for a particular tumor, it's these ones, the example in B, or for a different tumor, those 4, the example in C, or another one, those 4, the example in D. Now, I mentioned how understanding the cancer hallmarks, I think, is a very important theoretical underpinning for the use of medicinal plants to support the cancer patient. And that is because there are a number of medicinal plant phytochemicals like curcumin, resveratrol, many others that have been shown as part of the Halifax project to target all 10. Gently, pharmacologically mild, but if you're targeting all 10, that's going to help. And it will particularly support any other type of conventional therapy. And the tragedy I feel when it comes to the use of natural therapies in cancer is there's kind of a a non-recognition, a blind spot where it's happening everywhere, but mainstream medicine chooses to ignore it, but particularly in my view, or becomes concerned about its harm, but particularly in my view, is ignoring its potential for help. And it's this work of Hanahan that describes exactly how natural therapies are way more adept at doing that total battlefield concept against cancer compared to conventional drugs. Okay, so there's been now an update from Hanahan, and it was this update that was published in 2022 that inspired me to do these two presentations, because as our knowledge grows, so do the number of hallmarks and enabling characteristics. So in the 2022 paper, in addition to the 10 we've already discussed in part 1, you see there on the left, Hanahan proposed 4 more. In red, 2 enabling characteristics, epigenetic reprogramming, which is a revelation, and the microbiome, particularly the gut microbiome, is now getting recognition. And then 2 other emerging hallmarks is the phenotypic plasticity that cancer cells play and the role that senescent cells play as components of the tumor microenvironment in terms of them maintaining the tumor. So looking at each one in detail, there's the paper, the first click arrow, and then there's the new 4 second click arrow. Looking at each one in detail, unlocking phenotypic plasticity. So you see, normally what you have is up the top, you've got a progenitor cell and you get normal differentiation. But what can happen in a tumor cell is you either get de-differentiation, where it goes, a cell that was once a normally differentiated cell goes back to being a more primitive type of cell, or you can get blocked differentiation or trans differentiation. I'm not going to go into great detail here. It's all described in that paper, which is a free download if you're interested. So that's the first new hallmark. And then an enabling factor is this non-mutational epigenetic reprogramming. So the enabling characteristic of genome or DNA instability was described in the 2011 paper of Hanahan and Weinberg, and is a fundamental component of cancer formation and pathogenesis. And Hanahan now suggests in 2022 that a case can be made for another apparently independent mode of genome reprogramming that involves purely epigenetically regulated changes in gene expression. And that's why he terms it non-mutational epigenetic reprogramming. So just from a preventative perspective and even a therapeutic perspective, ensuring that a person's epigenetics are healthy, that their gene switches are right, that they are appropriately methylated, that they have sufficient levels of the nutrients that we now know that regulate epigenetic programming is important. And growing evidence, Hahnemann proposes, supports the proposition that epigenetic alterations can contribute to the acquisition of hallmark characteristics of the other hallmarks during tumor development and malignant progression. So it's not just an unstable and damaged genome, DNA, it's also those gene switches, which are the epigenetics, that can become unstable and damaged as well. And those two together are a powerful enabling characteristic of cancer development and progression. Another enabling characteristic is your microbiome, and that can be either good or bad from all those various tissues. And if it's imbalanced, it can lead to cancer growth, inflammation, immune evasion, genomic instability, and therapy resistance. So this is a huge area of research, new research that's now being targeted, is the impact of a person's microbiome on the development of cancer and indeed cancer therapy, improving cancer therapy. So certainly the simple story in terms of preventing cancer is to have as healthy a microbiome as possible and feed those beneficial organisms. And then we have another hallmark, which is the senescent cells. So as well as cancer cells, tumors comprise a range of other cells, including what are called corrupted stromal or tissue cells, mainly. And among those corrupted stromal cells can be senescent cells. And so what are senescent cells? They're cells that have aged, that are old and have stopped multiplying. So there's one theory that the risk of cancer goes up with age because as we get older and older, we accumulate more and more senescent cells that are still there alive, but have stopped multiplying or being usefully functional. But they do have a function, and that is they are functionally significant tumor promoting components of the tumor microenvironment. So their function now is a downside. And there's a whole area of anti-aging research and indeed anti-cancer research that is looking into a class of drugs called senolytics that help destroy senescent cells in body tissues. And that's thought to be significant in terms of promoting healthy aging, but also, as we can see, they represent a potential therapeutic target in a cancer tumor, either by pharmacological or immunological means. And it's interesting that a lot of these senolytic drugs that they're coming up with are initially, at least, of plant origin. So there we have it, from 6 to 10 to 14, and counting the tumor microenvironment, 15. And as our understanding of cancer grows via the delineation of the cancer hallmarks, so will our capacity to offer meaningful advice in terms of herbal and natural therapies, in terms of preventing and cancer and helping the cancer patient.